Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, John. That's a great wake-up call for us. So I guess what I want to do is just to frame up the conversation in some research that the FSC did over the last 18 months. And one of the things we wanted to understand almost a lifetime ago now is what was the political environment that kind of sat with us in just before the last election. We want to understand what New Zealanders thought about that. We then went on to look at some research and understand what did older New Zealanders think about KiwiSaver, what kind of role did it play in their lives, how much was in their KiwiSaver, how dependent on KiwiSaver were they. And then we wanted to contrast that with what we call Generation KiwiSaver, which were basically the under 35s. So if it's true to say that in all the data that we've just seen over the day, is that older New Zealanders are generally in a good space. They are generally the people who have seen their asset base rise because of property. They've generally been property investors and small business owners. And KiwiSaver was kind of like this rounding error that was a nice little augment that's only been there for 10 years. The average amount of money in KiwiSaver right now is around $16,000, $17,000, so that's not going to really get you to comfortable retirement. All the other stuff gets you a comfortable retirement. But if you counterpoint that with where younger New Zealand is, that's completely different. Because our kids are staring in Auckland to an average property cost of about $1 million, pretty tough to stomach. But probably more so, and this is to Nick's conversation earlier, you know, if you've been in KiwiSaver since you are 18 and you've ridden the ride all the way through to retirement, actually you've got substantive amounts of money in KiwiSaver, and in fact KiwiSaver will become more and more important as time goes on and as our kids' generation and their kids' generation comes through. So that was the context of it. What we then did was to pull that together into a recommendations paper, and of course that went to government. We launched our last conference, and it was really pleasing to see within the CFFC that a lot of the recommendations that were coming out of our research turned up as recommendations, and a number of them have already been adopted by government. So it feels like we're all singing from the same song sheet. We all see, John, some of the gaps in the system, and we're all wanting to make it a better system, and to the longevity of the system at $50 billion, this is going to become more and more and more important, not just in a retirement sense, but in the way we think about our capital markets, in the way we think about developing skills in New Zealand. KiwiSaver is going to be a huge driver for a lot of discussion, and I think the lens of the Royal Commission and the focus that it's put in the Australian context is that when you're sitting on a system in the trillions of dollars, it is serious, it is important, and getting that stuff right is critical. So there were a bunch of recommendations that came out of the different reports. What we've just bundled here is 4 of them, and then I'll just go on to briefly talk about 4 in a bit more detail, because the advice piece is important. So the piece around contribution is important. The more you put in, the longer it's there, the more appropriate your investment portfolio, the better advice you get along the way, the appropriateness of the fees, the how good is your fund manager. These are all components that went into that kind of contributions discussion. The other important thing that became pretty important, and in New Zealand it's fantastic, but there's a political opportunity here. In the Australian context, and if you tease into my accent, you'll know that's where I spent most of my life. Superannuation became a political part of the process. And so the complexity of the system, in my humble opinion, is in part because of different political ideologies you went through. So you've got different governments bringing different approaches to superannuation. Whereas here in New Zealand, we've got a younger system. It's much cleaner, it's much simpler. It's not yet a place where politicians are, if you like, playing political strategy in terms of where we're heading. And what's really good to see, and we'll no doubt hear from Minister Farfoy, is what his vision, or this government's vision of KiwiSaver is, and certainly what turned up out of the research was that New Zealanders absolutely want stability of policy, clarity of policy from a political lens, rather than it becoming a political football every time there's an election campaign. If we just talk a bit about the piece in recommendation number 3, it kind of spoke to the where is money invested, how do you get your money out, what are the triggers for that, and again, some certainty that's already started to kind of play through the system. But let me just touch more specifically on the advice piece. I think it's true in life that if you get good advice early on, so why would you spend your time and energy educating our kids about money? Well, because then they've got those skills for their lifespan. And so the advice piece became really important. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's face-to-face advice, it doesn't matter whether you've got, as Banker has, simulation games that you bring into schools, getting people at the front end of their financial lives and working lives capability around managing money and managing the KiwiSaver becomes really important. I think that's ultimately one of the contributors to why this default issue is so pressing. Because A, as John and many of others have made the case, conservative is the wrong portfolio to be in when you turn 16, 17 or 18 for the term of your life. But how do you make a decision about changing your portfolio? Well, you've got to get engaged. That's kind of like about education. And how many of us at 16, 17, 18 or early on in our piece are actually engaged in this stuff? So I probably choose to differ with my colleague John around what are the contributing factors, but the fact is people need to get active and need to get educated so they can make absolutely informed choices. I think the other thing is, and this is kind of true out of research across the world, the more involved you are earlier on, the better off you are, but actually it is those triggers of life change that get you engaged in financial matters, whether it's having your first kid or getting married or taking on your first mortgage or whatever. So kind of marrying the system's ability to touch people at that life stage change and then a delivery mechanism becomes really important. And so I think that's why things like technology are going to become increasingly important. Talking to a journo over the last week around how do people access advice and is robo-advice a threat to financial advisors? Absolutely not. Actually, they live side by side. And I think one of the interesting things, certainly that's happening in Australia, and starting to happen here, so if we think about superannuation as our first financial product and likely going to be with us through the duration of our lifespan, well, superannuation becomes a way to deliver a lot more than just, say, investment performance. It's about education, it's about advice, it could be about other financial products. This arbitrary point around 65 and the decumulation discussion that we're having, in other jurisdictions, that 65 piece is just arbitrary. Actually, at age 65, per the data from Alex, what's the average lifespan of people? Well into their 80s. So if at age 65, you've still got maybe a 20-year investment time horizon, it's a trigger for a conversation. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go into a conservative option. And so the ability of superannuation funds into the future actually to manage some of that risk, certainly manage the discussion, and certainly manage some of that decumulation or pension phase discussion, I think is going to become pretty important. Interesting point here, this contrasts what younger and older New Zealanders thought. I've kind of already summarised this, but I'll just touch on one or two key points. For older New Zealanders, what was pretty clear is that 10 years after retiring, all of their KiwiSaver is gone. So if you've got 16 or 17 grand when you retire, what are you going to do with it? Refresh the car, refresh the white goods, maybe have a holiday, whatever. And if you've well planned, you've probably got your property investments and other things taken care of you. For younger New Zealanders, their issues are around funding gaps. Their issues are about how to make KiwiSaver actually act in their best interest over the long term. And so I think there's an absolute opportunity out of this default review, but more broadly in the sector here, to make sure that people understand that KiwiSaver can be their financial accumulation product and service that can be with them over their lifespan. rather than just some random thing that you put money into, you don't see, you don't understand, and maybe you'll get into it when you're in your 30s or your 40s. So kind of interesting, a lot of good anecdotal stuff. We actually undertook some pretty good box pops, went out on the streets, asked people what they thought about KiwiSaver, asked them what they thought about where they're invested, will they have enough, and so on. And of course, those answers range from I'm very engaged and I know, through to I wouldn't have a clue. So if you want to have a look, all sitting there on the YouTube channel. Last one, if I may, and this is kind of the value of financial advice, however it's delivered. Good advice is pretty critical in whatever we're doing. Whether we have a life coach, or a fitness coach, a financial coach, someone, a career coach or whatever, at the point in times of your life where things go wrong or where things go right, or planning and preparing, that's where good advice comes in. And I think, again, to John's earlier point, the whole change of FizzLab and what that's going to bring into the world, and knowing who people are dealing with, and getting a trusted partner as you go through, who've been through the hoops, who've got the right qualifications, who run according to the right codes of conduct and so on, kind of become important. But that's the face-to-face stuff. So it's also fair to say that a lot of people aren't going to be using face-to-face advice, either if ever, or certainly early on in their careers. And so how do we bring this to life through technology, through apps, through gamifying the way people engage with financial education and scenarios that are relevant to them? I think it's going to be pretty important. So I might leave it there, leave a bit more time for a conversation, and thanks for your attention.